Now, general studies on to who is Big Brother.
You may well think that in Britain we haven't much of a problem about censorship. But there are 3 stories in this programme which say otherwise. On the whole in this country, it's not an obvious kind of censorship. It's the sort you only discover if you know where to look. Let's start by thinking about the Official Secrets Act and how it's used. In the Falklands War in the spring of 1982, this law was crucial. In a BBC Newsnight programme in July that year, Brian Hanrahan's reporting of the conflict was used as an example of how the Official Secrets Act worked.
At dawn, our Sea Harriers took off, each carrying 3 1,000-pound bombs. They wheeled in the sky before heading for the islands, at that stage just 90 miles away. Some of the planes went to create more havoc at Stanley, the others to a small airstrip called Booth Green near Darwin, 120 miles to the west. The pilots said there'd been smoke and dust everywhere, punctuated by the flash of explosions. They'd face a barrage of return fire, heavy but apparently ineffective. I'm not allowed to say how many planes joined the raid, but I counted them all out, and I counted them all back.
Originally, I was going to say 12 Harriers took off and came back. And they said, no, you can't say how many took part. It might be giving information away. And so I sort of crossed it around and fiddled it, and there, scribbled at the top, is the words I counted them. And it got fiddled with, and it came out like that. No, I mean, it was just one of those things.
How much censorship, if you like, were you under as you sent back your report?
Well, I suppose in terms of what you'd normally report, it was quite restrictive, but it was fairly clear-cut. It was military censorship, and it was for military purposes. You were not allowed to give any detail that might possibly be of benefit to the Argentine side.
So news of the war was tightly controlled by the Ministry of Defence to suit the national interest, and information was often withheld, sometimes for weeks.
Early this morning, British aircraft took action to enforce the total exclusion zone and to deny the Argentinians the use of the airstrip at Port Stanley. We are not yet able to give details, but will do so as soon as we have authoritative information.
That September, there was a debate about censorship in the Falklands at the Edinburgh Festival. A Ministry of Defence spokesman restated the position of the people who'd been running the war.
While we maintain the fullest possible flow of information about the services, their activities, and the policies of the Ministry of Defence as a whole, this must be compatible with the overriding dictates of national and operational security and the protection of lives of our servicemen and servicewomen.
This very powerful censorship had been frustrating for the journalists.
It's forgotten in debates like this that when we talk about the media, we mean the public. We're not out there to cause trouble. We're not out there to find something to boost our own egos and our own careers. We're there because we're doing a job, which is to tell the people back home what's happening. And in saying the media shouldn't know this, you're saying the public shouldn't know it.
I mean, sir, without sounding too pompous and profound, there is only one way of reporting a war. There is only one way of reporting. Our sensitivity and emotions in reporting a British war should not cloud the issue that we are still reporting a story. I mean, I could go on for ages, but I think that really ought to be enough.
Let's now look at a more surprising use of the Official Secrets Act. This is Mary Staunton. She's legal officer of the National Council for Civil Liberties, an independent body which keeps a watchful eye on legislation and lobbies for what it considers to be improvements. Mary Staunton explains something about the Official Secrets Act.
Section 2 of the Official Secrets Act says that it's a crime for anybody who is either a government servant or a contractor working for the government to reveal information about anything they learn in their employment to anybody else. Also makes it a crime for me or you to receive that information. Signing a piece of paper saying that I agree to abide by the Act is more or less neither here nor there. It's an act. You're either covered by it or you're not covered by it. The effect on people of signing that piece of paper is a very powerful psychological one. There are many examples that come up all the time of the way in which the Official Secrets Act is used as a deadening hand on information.
Would you expect facts about mental hospitals to be hidden as though they were state secrets? Wouldn't you think that, as any of us might come to need them, we should be able to find out all we want to know about them? Well, you'd be wrong. In July 1983, certain facts about mental handicap hospitals only came out because someone leaked a secret report to The Guardian, to David Henke, the social services correspondent.
Once we'd got hold of this one report, I set about specifically finding out copies of reports on every single hospital we could get hold of. Well, the details of this hospital in Croydon, we got this by a person leaking a confidential report on the conditions of this hospital. Because without those documents, and without actually people being prepared to leak them, The Guardian could not run a story saying that conditions were as bad as this, because they would have no proof.
The reports were written by what were called development teams. Exeter was one of the regions they ripped on. Luckily, one of the high-ups there, the administrator of the local health authority, was prepared to speak to us. His name is David King.
The development team was set up by Barbara Castle when she was Secretary of State for Social Services in 1976. And its business was to go round, by invitation from health authorities, to give advice and to comment on the standards of services for mentally handicapped people.
Elspeth Gray was on a development team. Her husband, Brian Ricks, is Secretary General of MENCAP, the National Society for Mentally Handicapped Children and Adults. We asked Elspeth to tell us about the development team and what it was like having to sign the Official Secrets Act.
Yes. Well, the team comprises 2 directors, one of whom is a psychiatrist, psychologists, nursing members, a member from administration, sometimes social workers, and in my case, the reason I was on is because I was a parent, and they always have a parent member on the team. I was due to go down for West Sussex Authority, and it was, I think it was the morning I was leaving, I received a letter to say I had to sign the Official Secrets Act. It was a bit of a perler. I mean, I knew that the team's reports were not made public, but I couldn't believe it. And therefore, everybody had to sign the thing. And when I got down to Sussex, I discovered in point of fact that somebody had refused. And so I was a bit ashamed, really, that I just got ahead and signed it. I probably should have refused as well.
Now, what has happened is, 6 or 7 years later, and when the team came back to look at the same places, they found very little being done. People hadn't been moved out, conditions were still appalling. So the Act, instead of being used as a facility for people to talk freely about appalling conditions to get something done, ended up being used as a cover-up.
Now, I've worked on development team reports which are purely for the health authority, and were not going to be published. Equally, I've worked on the Rampton Review, which was going to be published and was going to be a public document. And you work under the terms of the invitation.
For years and years and years and years, mental handicap was secret. Mental handicap was swept underneath the carpet. And the mere fact that the rump of this is still around is a terribly bad thing. And we are now approaching the 1990s, and we're now still talking about confidentiality being used actually as secrecy, and that is a nonsense.
Yes, and I mean, it's not the same kind of secrecy as mines and battleships in wars,
no.
Is it? It seems to me a completely separate thing, and I can't see the relevance of the Official Secrets Act to this particular to mental handicap, conditions in mentally handicapped hospitals or in the area, the whole community.
It's often extremely difficult for journalists to go behind the censor's back. But in this case, David Henke was able to because someone leaked the story to him. He told us as much as he could about this, though he wouldn't dream of revealing his sources.
Well, without people leaking documents to us, not only would a whole lot of things be covered up, and covered up for a long time. In the case of these reports, some conditions being kept secret for 5 or 6 years without the public knowing. But also, the public wouldn't know what plans the government were going to implement. These documents came into our possession after a long series of negotiations with a person who took their time and considered whether they should break the Official Secrets Act and leak this. What I arranged was that this person would turn up at King's Cross railway station. Railway stations are extremely good places for people to pass documents because they are crowded. People don't notice. They're busily rushing to catch the train they're about to miss. So they're not likely to notice someone meeting a person to hand over a document. This is also very convenient for the person to say, here, on train.
We asked the Health Authority Administrator what his feelings were about the leak to The Guardian.
Well, I think that's rather naughty, actually, because those reports were written in confidence and they were to those health authorities. And, well, he's a journalist and that's his business, but I think the person who did that wasn't playing the game.
Unfortunately for authority, leaking is often the name of the game. So often that it sometimes turned into a joke.
How come the Times knows the wording of the Henderson report before I do? Well, there's been a leak, Minister. I know that. It's marked confidential. I mean, I only got a draft report last night. Well, at least it wasn't labelled restricted. Why do you say that? Well, restricted means it was in the papers yesterday. Confidential means it won't be in the papers until today. Who leaked this? Humphrey? Oh, I'm sure he didn't, Minister. Are you? Well, he probably didn't. Well, it might have been someone else. These leaks are a disgrace. People think it's the politicians who leak. Well, it has been known, though. In my opinion, we're far more leaked against than leaking.
Some journalists are leaked to by ministers, but the secrets are never quoted unless the journalists have permission. These most privileged but self-censoring writers are the lobby correspondents. In the press gallery of the Houses of Parliament, we met Margaret Van Hattem of the Financial Times.
There are basically two sorts of correspondents working here. There are the gallery correspondents, whose job is mainly to take down what happens in the chamber of the Commons or the Lords. They report debates and major speeches, and they have fairly limited access to the rest of the build. And there are the lobby correspondents, who are much more involved in what goes on behind the scenes, committee meetings, party meetings, lobbying in corridors and things. There's a sort of adversarial relationship between the MPs and the lobby correspondents. The lobby correspondents are there to get them to say indiscreet things which they might not say had they not been softened up first. The MPs like to use lobby correspondents to float ideas that they would not like traced to themselves. So, for example, if one of them is fighting in committee to get something done, he may plant among lobby correspondents an idea that might discredit his opponent's thinking.
The government gives information, sometimes quite complicated information, such as court statistics, to lobby correspondents early. It also gives those correspondents the press release, which gives the government's interpretation of those statistics.
Yes, we often get on a confidential basis announcements, government announcements from Whitehall, which we then are able to read and write considered pieces on the understanding that we won't ask any questions about them. We won't ask MPs what they think about them. We will not try to elicit any extra information on them until the embargo on them has expired.
Now, as soon as the information is press released, then the press come to us immediately, it's news that day, and they want to know what our comment is on the government's information. Our comment may quite often be critical, though not always, but quite often. And we do not have time to digest what are often very complex documents and make a comment on them.
A lot of MPs resent this too, because it means that the press are ahead of them. And then when something is announced in the House, for example, and they have to immediately get up and ask questions, they haven't had time to read it properly. And it does cause resentment. On the advantage is that the next public open their newspapers, it's all there, there's been time to write it properly instead of a last-minute cobbling together exercise. So there are advantages and disadvantages.
So Margaret Van Hattem gets news ahead of others. It's what her job is all about. Yet most people can't even get important information on things that are vital to their own lives. Now, there is a right called freedom of information. What does it mean, and do we have it in Britain?
Freedom of information means the right of people in a country to know what the facts are upon which decisions are based. It's the right to know what information governments have, what information local authorities have. Now, in some countries, such as Sweden, they started developing this right as far back as 1766, and by the early 19th century, they had a fairly comprehensive right to know law. Other countries have come in later. The other Scandinavian countries have come in. Australia's starting to. Canada has a freedom of information law. Belgium has. The United States has.
We haven't got such a law, even when it comes to finding out personal things. For instance, Mr. and Mrs. Reed have no right to know what's been written in their boys' school records. They suspect that the files contain inaccuracies, even lies, which have messed up the boys' education. Their struggle against secrecy led them to look for help from the Children's Legal Centre, where Peter Newell is handling their case.
Mr. and Mrs. Reed first came to see me in August '82, and their twin sons had been out of school since the previous December. They'd been placed by the Inner London Education Authority in a boarding school for educationally subnormal children.
The Reeds weren't told it was a special school. When they realised it was, they knew it was completely wrong for the twins. So after one term, in December 1981, they took Stuart and Jason away from it.
They decided they didn't want the boys to go back there. They wanted them in local ordinary schools. And they'd been making some representations to the authority to try and get that to happen.
What's in the boys' school files, do you think?
I don't know. And we've been asking for 1 year and 8 months now. Can we see them, but we're not allowed to see them.
So what are you doing about it?
I've asked the Children's Law Centre, Mr. Newell, on our behalf to see if he could get the files for us. That was refused. We asked them to be destroyed. That was refused. So on no grounds in any way can we see them files, and we're told that we cannot see them files.
They came to me because they'd got to the end of the line, they didn't know what else to do. And we then wrote on their behalf to the authority, saying that the parents wanted the boys placed in local ordinary schools, and we had of course checked with the boys that that was what they wanted too. And we also asked the authority if the Reeds could see the reports and records on the basis of which the boys had been placed in this boarding special school, because the Reeds certainly didn't understand it, nor did I, having met the boys.
Would you like to be able to see what's been written about you in the last few years?
Yeah, because we can't see him, you see, and I would like to see him, yeah. Most people probably give up against the people that want us back at boarding school. And they can't stand people who keep on, because my mum's kept on for 1.5 years, and I'm really proud of her.
The authority did agree to arrange a case conference to discuss the boys' education, and the officers from Hall arrived carrying these enormous files on each of the twins. This was all material that the parents had not been to see, and it was quite obvious from the conversation that decisions were really being based on what was in the files rather than on the twins themselves.
I was very angry. I asked one of the committee men to show me the the piece of paper what he's got down there and the files that he children. As he was passing it over to one colleague, I tried to snatch it, but seems so happen he had quicker reflexes than me, and he got it back as quicker as, look at you, he just wouldn't let us see them. And this is what's keeping our children out of school, nothing else.
But following that, placements were arranged at ordinary secondary schools for each of the boys. One of them worked well in the first term of 1983, and he's still doing fine, Jason, at that school. The other boy was accepted at a school, but only on a trial period for 6 weeks. And from the beginning, it seemed fairly clear that that school had made up their minds about him.
So then he was told to get out of the school. But there was no reason in the report in school why he left there.
That's true.
Yeah? So we're still, here we are again, back to the secret files.
The Reeds case is not at all unusual. I think almost always when parents find themselves in conflict with educational authorities over their children's schooling, one of the really crucial issues is the reports and records which are kept both in schools and education offices.
Even when they die, they said you can still fight on. You fight on till, until you get cleared. In a way, you know, like
if you go out for a job,
you go out for a job.
Not get it. They show you the files, wouldn't they?
So
it could be a good job, important job, but you wouldn't end up getting it, would you?
I think secrecy really stems from an incredible arrogance, whether it's the arrogance of government or of professionals, believing that they have a particular right and power to make decisions on behalf of, as it were, ordinary people.
Right and power, it would seem, belong here. Right to know more about us than we know ourselves, and the power to keep us in the dark.
Not only do we have the old blunderbuss of the Official Secrets Act in this country, but we also have a great love of secrecy, which is what other countries call the British disease.
Yes, I suppose I am a big brother, because I'm in a position of some influence in the health services locally. And you know, when I'm an ordinary citizen, I don't like big brothers any more than anybody else. And there's only one way to control them, and that's to make all the things they do more public.
Well, this country seems to regard secrecy as a way of life, almost. There is a natural reticence and embarrassment, really, on disclosing anything on policy that people might find uncomfortable. But I think in this specific instance, we've got the problem, the fact that it deals with the civil service, where they are trained to be secret.
It's not just what information is held about me, it's the use that that information is put to that's important. So I don't mind at all if I'm on a list of people who are interviewed for this programme. I do object if the heading on that list is instead IRA suspects, for example.
I'm a foreigner, and I find that the British are rather secretive, and I find it curious that they have this attitude that you shouldn't really have information until you can be trusted with it. So they like to get you to know you first before they tell you anything, which is why things like the lobby system are set up and why they have press officers everywhere in Whitehall who, once they think they can trust you, you can get past them. But they exist, actually, not to dispense information, but to make sure that it doesn't get out.